Welcome to a new episode of the Astral podcast. Today we're starting a new series. Since Elena left us, we will begin again the podcast and continue her work and our work. And today, to start in the first episode, we have with us Josefina Arribas, welcome, and Dorian Greenbaum, who has already been with us in one discussion in the podcast. So I welcome you both, and today we'll be discussing the new book that you have edited on Jewish divination. Josefina works at the Institute for Jewish Studies at the University of Münster. She has written several works on Jewish knowledge related to astronomy, astrology, and she has very interesting books and papers which I had loved to read on the Jewish tradition of astrology. Dorian specializes in the study of Hellenistic astrology, Hellenistic tradition, mainly, although she has done other works in the history of astrology also related to Kepler. She has edited several volumes, and she's currently working on, help me Dorian, you are at the University of...
University of Wales, Trinity St. David.
Exactly, I always get that one mixed.
It's easy to do.
Yeah, lots of names. So again, welcome. So today we're going to talk about this edited volume, which is Unveiling the Hidden, Anticipating the Future, Divinatory Practices Among Jews Between Qumran and the Modern Period. So this is from the collection Prognostication in History, edited by Brill and associated with the IKGF project in Erlangen. And the book covers a lot of subjects exactly on what the title says, so Jewish divination, and I found it very interesting because it collects, it has almost a sample of various types of approaches to divination, among them astrology and calendrical work. I must say that my main interest goes to the ones that mention astrology, but I also found the others very interesting, dream divination and physiognomy by Joseph Ziegler, whom I know. And I thought the book is very good to give an idea of the approach of divination from the point of view of Jewish culture and Jewish religion. I especially enjoyed your paper, your chapter, Josefina, because it does tackle a question that has always interested me, which is how the Jewish perceive at least astrology, not only divination in general, but astrology, and are they against it? It's how does Jewish religion addresses astrology? Because I've been working a lot with the Christian, which is more commonly known, the precepts against it. So it was interesting to read yours, and I'll have to go to a second round and annotate a few things for future reference. So again, welcome. I think the book is a very good work. You have collected a very nice sample of academic papers. So I would start to ask you, how did this book came to be?
Yeah. Well, it was initially a workshop at the IKGF, International Consortium for Research in the Humanities, at the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg. I was a fellow there during 2014-15, and I was there with a project about divination in Jewish culture. I was working specifically with geomancy, not with divination in general, but of course geomancy was considered in the context of other divinatory practices. And while I was there, I observed that as the IKF, the research had been working for several years when I arrived, and it continued for several years after I left. They were dealing with divination in many European Western cultures and in China, of course, but Jewish culture was not represented among the practices or the theory about the divination. And then I decided, okay, we have to celebrate something to bring scholars working in this field, because there are several. I mean, it's not an old field, but there are people who have been working in divination for several years now. And then I thought, okay, let's try to do a meeting, to make a call and bring people and discuss this. And then there were several scholars. We have a 2-day meeting, and we discuss, we present, and then we decided to publish. I mean, I wanted to publish something from the beginning. Mm-hmm. Then that's the origin. And I want to say something about the book, because usually in Jewish studies, divination has been always considered in the context of magic. Then magic is a very, very popular subject, and we can say there have been studies, there are studies in Jewish magic since the 19th century. But there is no book devoted to divination, Jewish divination alone, as far as I know, in the bibliography available. Then I think this is an important contribution, because I think sometimes they overlap, but not always. Then I think divination deserves, let us say, to a special place, yeah, for it, for itself.
Mm. I found particularly interesting in the introductions where you speak of the different ways you can classify the different forms of divination, being more technical, more based on random events, something more natural. And I think that was very interesting. Sometimes it's of course obvious if we start thinking about the classification settles obvious, but it's very rarely that we have it written and studied and analyzed like that, and that was very interesting as well. It's a very simple concept, but it's interesting too, so that we can separate what kind of approach we have for divination, and are we talking about something that has more based on chance, and others that are based on specific events and the interpretation of specific events. So that was very, very, very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, of course, divination is just a name for a whole set of practices and theories also, because there is always some theory or some expectation behind the practice. In the book, in the introduction, we talk about epistemologies of the divination. There are different, and of course there is a kind of divination which is more inspirational, and another one which is based more in techniques, and the person, the client who is going to ask about this hidden knowledge or this knowledge of the future, sometimes has to rely more in the expertise of the technician, or just has to rely on the right way or the right performance of the technique of the, let's call it technique, but not so much in the interpretation or the expertise of the person who is performing this specific technique, whatever it is. Then yes, there are different kinds behind the same name. Even the name is very interesting, because when I was at the IKF, in one of these meetings we used to have, which were very useful and very illuminating sometimes, because there were people from very different backgrounds and doing very different things, and some of them were just doing or dealing with divination for the first time. People coming from law or from history, but just landing in the study of divination for the first time, and with an approach which was completely fresh and was also very helpful. I remember in one of these meetings to have suggested, okay, we are using the word divination, but we have to think a little about this because there is some kind of meaning behind the word. Because divination, as Dorian maybe she can explain better than me, divination is related with Deus, with Dia, with Zeus. There is an idea behind of light, of the heaven, and the divinity. Then when we are using divination to refer and to denotate some kind of techniques which are dealing only, or which are based only on randomness, on random techniques.
I just wanted to add that the topic of divination, just tout court, is quite interesting and quite complex, and its practices are very, very ancient, of course. So when you were talking about different types of divination, I mean, we could look at the Greek perspective, from which comes this word mantike, which according to Plato has to do with mania, or frenzy, or or what's called inspired divination. So that would be like, for instance, the Pythia at the Delphic Oracle being inspired to give the answer to the question from something that's coming outside of her being, and it's sort of being channeled through her, and the information is given to the client. So there's this idea of natural or inspired divination. That's one part of the equation, and then there's the other kind, which Cicero in his treatise on divination, De Divinatione, calls artificial divination, or divination by art or craft. Right, and that's where we get into the technical side. Of course, the Greek word techne means both art and craft. So there's a certain amount in that kind of divination. There's a certain amount of interpretation that has to go on, and that's given by a practitioner. Which I think, and I think that most of, if not all of the topics in this book are technical kinds of divination. So it's such an ancient topic, and it's really so nuanced and complex, and people often think that, oh, divination is just about telling the future, but it isn't just that. In antiquity, especially in the Mediterranean world, it has to do with knowing the past, the present, and the future. Or things that might be hidden in any one of those kinds of time frames, and finding out hidden information. So it's way more than just predicting the future. And I think you can see that in a lot of the essays in the book, that it isn't just prediction.
Yeah, and I think that's something important to really understand and clarify and reflect on, because it is a field with various nuances, as we were saying, that have to be acknowledged, so we really know what we're talking about.
Yes.
Not generalizing as sometimes outsider view will do.
And Josefina also brought up this idea of the right time and the right action, and that is very, very much a part of divinatory practices. Certainly from the Mesopotamian milieu, really up until the present, and we certainly see that in astrology, and we see it in other disciplines too. What is the right moment to do something? And that can involve divinatory techniques as well.
the right time is
very,
very precious knowledge.
yeah. What the Greeks call kairos. You know, I mean, it's very, very important.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And did you find much? Since I don't know if this is a proper question, but have you found anything that's particular to the Jewish approach to divination that you won't find, for example?
That was the question behind the whole thing, the meeting at the IKF, and also the book. And this is a question which is work in progress. The answer is work in progress. But certainly, I think we said in the introduction, in the essay, in the introduction somewhere, that these practices are Jewish, even if they are just they look the same as other practices that were being done in the same period or after or before or in lands which were around where Jews live or no. But they are Jewish because they were practiced, they were done by Jews, and also because they were done in very Jewish context. Of course, they are also Jewish because the name of God which is very important in Jewish religion, appears in this, is used in these techniques, in many of them. Because certain biblical characters also appear. Abraham is very important, Daniel, or other prophets appear here and there. It is also Jewish because there are specific prayers, Jewish prayers that are placed that are required before performing the divinatory event or during the divinatory event. And also, which the only thing I have found special, and it's not so special because I know there are also this kind of special status is also in Christian sources. I don't remember now in Islam, but in Christian sources it is this question of the special status of Israel as regards divination. This question emerges a lot of times in astrological texts. Dealing with the influence of the stars, because there is in the Talmud this question, the Mazal Israel. Israel does not have a planet or a star. It depends on how we translate Mazal, which is also an ambiguous word in Hebrew, but you can say planet, star, whatever. There is no astrological influence for Israel. But at the same time, there is that discussion, no, there is astrological influence for Israel. What happens? Why Israel is special? Because Israel has a special relationship with God. They have a special consideration. And then somehow when they are, the explanation that for instance gives Abraham Bahia in his letter, which is also in one of the chapters in the book. But I think this question also emerges in the chapter of Alessia Belushi about Sheilat Halom, dream request. Is that, as Israel has this special status because it's the chosen people, when they perform the mitzvot, when they follow the commandments and follow the right path, which is the path of God, somehow they are in the safe path all the time. There is nothing bad can happen and there is not bad influence, only good influence. There is, when they refer to this special situation of Israel vis-a-vis the stars, concerns mainly in the astrological text. When there is discussion about this question, it concerns mainly the bad influence of the stars. There is no discussion about the good influence. I mean, then it's the bad influence. I mean, if it's something, an earthquake or a flood or whatever is going to happen, but Israel can be safe if they just keep at the side of God. Then this is the idea, and this idea is very special is very Jewish.
What's interesting to me is that the Jews who are living in this Mediterranean milieu where they're exposed to all the different types of divination that are going on. So they're taking things like a dream request, which is very common in the ancient world. The idea that you would go to a temple and have an incubation and lay down and ask for a dream, you know, or you'll do certain practices that are astrological in nature. But for the Jews, they always transform that into something that is inextricably tied to the religion itself. And so, as Josefina says, you know, Israel has no star. You know, this idea of the Mazal of Israel. They adapt the polytheistic practice to their monotheistic religion and practice. But it's so interesting to see. I mean, just from the standpoint of historical research, to see how things adapt and get transformed to suit the particular culture that they're in.
In the first chapter of the book by Michael Schwartz, he says something about that we shouldn't place any emphasis about the differences between cultures and religions as regards divination, because there are many parallels. I mean, sometimes it's just influence, but sometimes they are just taken from the same source and doing it in their own ways according to their cultures, periods, lands, languages.
Yeah. And I wonder, I'm not sure if the study was that extensive, but do you see a difference in time? What I mean is, from a more religious and practices focused more on the Jewish culture, and then as the Jewish culture is integrated, or at least it is working within other cultures such as Christian culture in Europe, do we see significant changes to these practices? You know, certain practices disappearing or others appearing. Is there any change in time? I know this might be a difficult question, which would perhaps need more research, but I was thinking, for example, certain practices within the European Christian context would be difficult to do because they would be considered strange or superstitious. I think, I don't know, in certain cultures. So do we see that happening in some way?
Well, what I can tell, I haven't looked at this in detail, having focused in one practice and saying, okay, I'm going to see how it moves. I have been working a lot of time in astrology, and of course there are influences of the milieu in which the Jews are living. Yeah. Of course, if they are living very close to Christian culture, they are taking things, but you know, also because maybe we should think that not always, but at certain moments and in certain places, many places, maybe more than expected, not only Al-Andalus and this idea of the convivencia. In Christian Europe, sometimes Jews and Christians just were living the same culture. I mean, were living many components. It was just the same culture, the same language, and the main difference was the religion. They were also, you know, dealing with similar problems and with similar solutions. Well, we have to think that there was something. There was a shared space. There was a common place. There was a common language, and the culture was there. I mean, it was also common with differences. Minor differences, and especially the religion was the religion of each one, and well, this idea.
Certainly, and I think, I think we do see that. That's why my question, we see the adaptation to the culture, and it's a whole. They are, as you said, they are living in the same culture. It is the same group. It is the same. They are the same social environment, with the exception of the religion and some practices, eating habits, etc. But pulling up to a topic that has to do more with the project and the podcast, regarding astrology and the astrological practices. You have at least two chapters that deal with this with the practice of astrology. Let me see, how can I ask this? How would you characterize, if we can characterize, the Jewish practice of astrology in relationship to divination? Could you speak a little bit about that?
I don't know if I understand the question. What is the place of astrology in divinatory techniques?
Well, in Jewish thought. So in Jewish in Jewish thought, how is astrology seen in terms of its practice? Not as they would practice mostly the technical aspects. I think are basically the same, in at least in a general way. But how is astrology seen? Are there differences between when are you going to astrology? How is astrology considered?
Well, yes, of course, it depends on the authors and you can find many differences in the authors, also in time, and also in according to the geographical areas, because if you look at the north of Europe, what is called Ashkenaz, North France and Central Europe, Germany, we find that the kind of astrology that was practiced there, as far as we know, according to the sources, it was mainly kind of astrological, kind of popular practices. You don't find, for instance, the kind of astrology you find in Al-Andalus, so in Christian Europe, where the Jews who are writing about astrology or who are practicing astrology, of course, have this also, let's call folk forms of astrology, which are easier, which are more, which are available for everybody. We can say almost for everybody. And the kind of astrology that practice, for instance, Abraham Bajilla, or Abraham Ibn Ezra, or Leila Gerson, or other people, is very technical, and of course it's not for everybody. You need the astronomical background, which is something that not everybody has, and of course, in addition, the practice of this, which is it's not only to, as we are talking about astrology, is not to make the horoscope, which is the astronomical part, let's say using tables, instruments, whatever, but it's also the part of interpretation that requires a long training, because you have to make sense of all this data there, and well, it's not for everybody. Then this kind of astrology, it seems that according to the sources, was not practiced in Northern Europe in the Middle Ages. But there are very interesting texts of folk astrology, and of course, in going to Southern Europe, in Spain or Southern France, of course, we find this very sophisticated astrology, which has also, especially for those authors who are also scholars, I mean, they make questions. I mean, why this works? Why does it? Of course, when one is interested in getting results, just practice. I mean, I want to know this, and goes for this kind of easy astrology, which is usually kind of astrology we find, for instance, in the north, as I said. But if the person who is practicing astrology is interested not only in the results, not only getting yes, no, do this, do that, or it's going to be bad if you do that, or it's going to be well if you do this. If you are interested in knowing why, and usually scholars make this kind of questions, they are also working in how astrology fits in this kind of idea of the world that is going on, and is kind of intellectual koine going on in their time. They have to fit astrology, for instance, in the classification of sciences, and to find out what is this is science, this is myth. I think this is maybe a question which is not only I am sure it's not only in Jewish authors, it's also in Christians, and it's also in the antiquity, as historian can tell. We always find just texts dealing with the practice, getting results, getting answers, and this is the aspect of decision making. These are tools for taking decisions, to take decisions, but also they are tools of knowledge. And then whatever you know has a place, and you have to make sense of it.
Yeah. I mean, a couple of thoughts come to mind as you were talking, Josefina. I mean, the first is that you're talking about different kinds of astrology, you know, and on the technical side, and you see scholars like Ibn Ezra Barhiya and others who are very interested in technique and very skilled at a lot of different techniques, and I would guess that they are either focusing on natal astrology or what we call mundane or universal astrology, which is one set of things to focus on. But the other side is what we call elections in astrology, so picking the best time to do something. And that is a whole other animal, and I mean, in my view, it has more connection to a divinatory practice, maybe, than the other one does, or it's more overt, maybe. The other thing that occurred to me is that this distinction of astrology as a science, you know, which comes in the Arabic period, when astrology becomes known as the science of the stars, right? And I think that is something that's very much taken up in the Jewish milieu, that astrology is a science. It's not a superstition. You know, it's a serious science with serious results and serious techniques. But in terms of the kinds of astrology that are covered in our book, specifically, it has to do with picking the right times to do something. That's a very important part.
Yeah. It's also the question of the use of astrology for magic. It also appears some stuff. And also this kind of there is in this kind of technical astrology, the kind of astrology that is reflected in Barhiya's letter, which is explained, which is translated in the book, in one of the chapters. This astrology is somehow naturally related to science for the author, with limitations, of course, as he himself explains in the letter. But at the same time, this kind of astrology, which appears in other practices, from my point of view, there is I detect some kind of natural relationship with religion.
Mm-hmm.
And because it somehow is more inspirational, and there is this link. On one side, there is this link with religion, and from the other is with knowledge, with science in the broad sense in which it was understood in the modern times, with the meaning of science we have now. There is this polarity, or this ambiguity of astrology, and of course, we are going to find it in one or the other, depending on the text that we are dealing with. And I'm talking about the text because most of the witnesses are textual. I mean, we don't have much materials dealing with divination. There is something, but there are no meanings.
Yeah, and in this particular text, which I mean, when I became involved in this project, which was was about 2018, maybe, Josefina, I think, maybe, something like that. And
we were dealing with the problem.
Yeah, I have to say, I found the whole process of working on this book with you extremely educational from my own personal point of view, because I was quite unfamiliar with a lot of the kinds of practices that people talked about in the book. I mean, I knew some, and I have a background in the history of astrology and technique in particular, and Hellenistic astrology, but it was a real education for me to work on this book, and totally fascinating. But I was also particularly taken with this letter that Bahia wrote in response to the circumstances of this wedding, in which the beautifully elected time that they had chosen to have the wedding, everything was wonderful, and all of a sudden you have this unforeseen thing happening where they had to postpone the wedding, and then the discussion about and Bahia actually choosing another time, and the groom saying, "Yep, good for me, fine," and then having these objections to it. I mean, it encapsulates this one. It's such an important letter, first of all, but it really encapsulates so many of the issues that we still see in astrology, and certainly Bahia is seeing them in this medieval time frame of the conflict between certain astrological practices and the way people look at astrology versus people who see it as completely not licit, and you can't do that, and Bahia's letter, which of course is a defense of the legitimacy of astrology, brings all those things out, and it's just such a wonderful historical example. It was so exciting to work on this, and I'm so grateful to you, Josefina, for actually bringing it to light.
Thank you for your help with everything. No, it's a very interesting letter. It's a difficult text also. It's difficult. That's the reason why I think it wasn't translated before, because it's a difficult text. There is a lot of going on in it. And it's very nice to see how one of these scholars is just practicing divination for just a quotidian thing, a wedding. There is a mind, we are going to choose the wedding because we want this wedding to be the best. We want to avoid anything. As far as possible, to avoid any bad aspect or any bad thing can happen in the future. Then they choose the hour, and it's very nice how what is difficult in this letter, and which is also fascinating, and I think it deserves further study, is the way how Bahia navigates these bans and these prohibitions, in the Bible and in the Talmud, how he navigates all this, and is successful some way, apparently, to convince, at least for some readers, he was convinced. Langermann thinks that the letter was successful because no many people were. That there are no many documents after Bargilla's letter explicitly written against astrology. Of course, we have Maimonides' letter, which is very important. Everybody knows about this letter.
Yeah.
We have also Isaac Polgar, which is less known, but is also an important document. And of course, there are always these kind of discussions and polemics about astrology, but not so long as the letter.
I think that, yes, it takes somebody with a certain amount of skill, not just in translating Hebrew, which is obviously is important, but you have a background in understanding the whole technical milieu in which Bargilla is writing. I mean, because you've done so much work on Jewish astrology in this time frame, that, I mean, you're really the perfect person to do this, because you understand things that somebody else might miss.
Yeah, I think one has to read the letter with a clear eye for astrology, but also a clear eye and a clear sensibility, not only for astrology, but also for this complicated, this complicated land Bargilla was going through. Yes, he was to be very careful also, because he was sending this letter. It's an open letter. I think in the public of the letter was everybody.
Yeah,
was interested in this discussion about is it legitimate to practice it or is not legitimate? Is this Chaldean or is not Chaldean?
right. Yes, he has a very sophisticated.
The letter to Arribas, and then he has to use the language of the Halacha, of the Jewish law, and then the letter is very halachic, and then you need somehow the astrological interest to maybe to sympathize with Bargilla's position and understand him. Especially, it's very moving. I felt somehow moved when he's saying, "Okay, all my life I've been doing this, and at this point, when I have deserved, consideration and respect from the powerful, because he was doing astrology for kings. Okay, and now at this stage of my life, when I have a certain status, I have been questioned for all this, and I have been very seriously questioned because of this activity. And still, he wants to defend it, but he wants to defend it using the language of those who are going to be his contributors, his opponents, his enemies in a way. About the enemies of astrology.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. No, it's a very. I loved specifically that document, because I think it's, as I said before, it's quite interesting to have also that testimony, as a defense to astrology, because with this we can have a more full set, the main philosophical ideas that each defender of astrology has, both in Arabic, Christian, and now in Jewish context, which we didn't have that much information, and now with this letter we have it. And
what is important is that this alone document, because we are going to find many testimonies about astrology, and also we can say philosophical. I mean, dealing with theoretical backgrounds for astrology, even in Abrahamic and Ezra. There is not a text specifically. Of course, we have the technical text, but there is no theoretical background. And he's not saying, maybe there are here and there hints. You can find keys here and there, but maybe the biblical commentaries are a good key to understand how he's integrating astrology in the Jewish religion, but also in Jewish thought. Because also, but of course, it's not something long. It's not a test that from the beginning to the end is dealing with the subject. You have to pick up things here and there and make sense of this information, which is just given in very different contexts.
Yes.
But there are, and also in other texts, Levin Bergerson also has interesting things. There are different authors dealing with theoretical background for astrology, explaining why it makes sense, how astrology, and this is the case for Abrahamic and Ezra, I think, and also for Gersonides, but not only. There are other authors that somehow astrology, because it's also the science, the divinatory practice that deals with the signs which are the higher, because these are the signs of the heavens, which are above the four elements. That astrology somehow is the way providence, God's providence, is regulated, administrated.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm recalling an episode that Elena discusses in her MA dissertation, which is exactly on Abraham Gedalia, which is the court physician at the coronation of Dom Duarte, a Portuguese king, and it's the chronicle. This is all based on chronicles, and the chronicle says that he advised the king to postpone the date of coronation, explaining that the configuration was not very good at that day. But the king wanted to be crowned in a specific day, which was a religious festivity. I think it was the Ascension of Our Lady. I think that was the day, if I'm remembering correctly. And so he insisted in doing that, and he didn't want to accept the advice, because that would mean that he would be putting more faith into astrology than in the divine. And I remember that one of the comments that it is placed in the mouth of the astrologer by the chronicle is that, but why is that a problem if God wants it this way? So clearly for the Jewish astrologer, it would not be a problem to change the date for a more suitable time and day, because that would be the will of God, that things would be better at that time, and that resonates, I think, very well with what you were saying, and I was just remembering this small episode, and it really illustrates that kind of thinking, in which
of course, because they cannot question God's rule. Islam, one cannot be then God sits always there. I mean, this is a theocratic society, obviously.
Yeah.
And religion is, we cannot forget that, because we are scholars living in a world which is completely different. But somehow God is always in the picture, even if
yes, and this idea, yes, exactly, and this idea of it's God. That, okay, so you have a certain stellar influence that's visible for us to see, but God can always step in and say, wait a minute, no, well, if you do the right thing, if you're righteous and just, then we can get rid of some of the stuff that maybe you don't want to happen. And it's so clear in this letter. I mean, that the example of Hezekiah, right? That he mentions in the letter about getting more years of life than you should, you would be otherwise allotted. I mean, and this actually, I have no idea whether somebody like Bahia actually knew about more ancient traditions, but you could find this in Egyptian culture. Where, I mean, and there are papyri and documents that talk about for instance, the Prince of Byblos asking for 50 more years of life than what had been allotted to him, and Amun saying, well, yeah, okay, you're a good guy and you're doing the right thing, so all right. This is in a long tradition of a deity being able to change fate, so to speak, or at least the possibility of negotiating with fate. And I found that part of the letter also quite fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, and you later will find in Christian discourse it's a similar thing, which if you are righteousness and pious and lead a good life, then your time will be naturally extended because it's more in tune to a good life and a proper life.
And even when Bahia talks about, he has a little bit in there talking about, well, you know, if your doctor says, well, you shouldn't eat that food at your age, you know, even in terms of the sort of mundane physical things, you can, he's applying that sort of backwards in an astrological, you know, context there. And I thought that was also quite interesting. So he's looking not only at the spiritual and the moral issues, but even physical ones.
This is a good example of the relationships also of medicine and astrology.
Exactly.
Sciences or kinds of technique.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Knowledge based on experience also.
Yes, absolutely.
And also conjectural sometimes.
Yep.
Most of the times.
Yes.
Yes. And said a lot about this too, because I've been working with medicines.
Yes, and of course astrology and medicine have a very long history.
And for example, here in Portugal, in Jewish context, what we find of scientific texts or astrological texts have also a deep relationship with medicine. Usually the two appear combined. We don't have many testimonies, unfortunately, or we haven't still uncovered a lot of them, but they are medical astrological texts.
Yeah, and some of the essays in the book do touch on those kinds of topics, like the ones on physiognomy, for instance, and the bloodletting.
The interpretation of dreams.
Yes, and dreams in a medical context as well. Yeah, absolutely. That's another thing.
Bloodletting is also mentioned by Bahia, because bloodletting was done according to astrology. I mean, there are good moments for this, and that was very clear. It's a long tradition.
Yep.
That's also a very clear context for the relation of astrology and medicine. I mean, there are relations in many ways also in Jewish world, because so frequently Jewish scholars, astronomers, were also physicians, and at the same time they were astrologers. Then there is this over. It's so frequent, very
yes.
And then they were at the same time physicians. Sometimes they don't mention a word about this, and you don't see anything of their work as physicians. But you know, because of the sources, from other sources, that they were physicians. Then it's also another way of this relation, another form of this relation.
Well, I think you have a wonderful work here. My congratulations to you both for editing, and of course for the authors of each of the chapters.
Not anything about the author.
Before we go, would you like to just say a little bit about some of the?
I think we should say something, because this book is so. Yeah. Well, we have 10 chapters. And we have Michael Dov Swartz, who is the first chapter. We decided to put the chapters more or less in a chronological order, although sometimes there is some overlapping, because this chapter is a very, very good introductory chapter, and he explains how this is. I said before, not to place too much emphasis in differences among the cultures, because divination seems to be a transcultural or cross-cultural phenomenon. And he also underlines that we are dealing mainly with the textual sources, because there is. We also mentioned in the introduction that there is a material culture of divination. We have this last chapter by Charles Burnett, dealing with the material aspects of magic, grimoire, how the materials and the tools to write how this has to be done with in a specific way, which is determined is almost like a ritual. If you want to make it efficient, to make it work, it has to be done in a certain way and with specific materials.
But the methods themselves are also very, very interesting, and you can see all of the theory behind the practice in that, and the idea that I at first glance, I think you look at Charles Burnett's chapter as like, why is this here? But but if you read it,
we are dealing really with magic. What is this?
well, yes and no. I mean, the thing is that it's a look at the materiality of practice. You know, the literal materiality, which I thought was just a very nice little wind up to the other chapters of the book, which sometimes were much more sort of spiritually located. Or religiously located, and I just thought this was a wonderful ending, you know, to bring us back to earth, so to speak, and to see how earth and sky relate in a very material way.
Yeah, and also Alessia Belushi is using this idea, and I think she's using the expression magic to denote the kind of practice that she's explaining in her chapter. The one dealing with dream request, which is the idea that you want to know something and you have to make a sort of ritual, make your question and go to sleep, and you receive a kind of revelation by a supernal being or an angel who is going to say the answer, or either you are given a symbol in the dream you dream with something or about something, and then this has to be interpreted. You know, this kind of combination here. There is inspirational, there is some kind of revelation, but at the same time it can be a symbol, and then you have to interpret back. There were handbooks for these things, which are this kind of handbooks to interpret whatever you see in a dream. Is the subject of Blanca Villuenda's chapter, who is dealing with just like Alessia Belushi is dealing with texts from the Cairo Geniza in Hebrew, which is very important because it has a repository of fragments that have to be recovered and interpreted and put together to be read and translated and understand what is. And there are many dealing with magic and divination. Then Blanca Villuendas is dealing with fragments of this kind, but dealing with dreams, but in the form of Pitron Haromot, which is interpretation of dreams. And then there were handbooks, and she explains specifically, as Dorian mentioned, a chapter of one of these handbooks dealing with bloodletting, and she compares with a Hebrew version, which is a stand, and this comparison in the Hebrew and Judeo-Arabic, and explains a little how this, and also underlines the necessity, which is, I think, is something general, and I think we also mentioned this in the introduction, that there is a huge amount of text to be discovered and to be translated. I mean, they are there, and they have already been discovered, but they have to be rediscovered through investigation, through research, through edition, translation, this kind of things.
Yes, and the work that Alessia and Blanca are doing is just so important in this regard, for really doing a deep dive into one example of these kinds of practices. It's really wonderful.
Yeah, and these two chapters by Alessia and Belushi and Blanca Villuendas, they are very philological. I mean, they edit texts in Hebrew, in Judeo-Arabic, they make comparisons with other parallel sources or similar sources, and they also paid a lot of attention to the style, to the language. And we have also the second chapter by Helen Jacobus, which is a very interesting one. It's dealing with the fragments from Qumran, and and is from the Second Temple period, and dealing with this kind of literature in Aramaic. Most practically all the fragments she's dealing with have been published, but she is reconsidering them again and presenting a new hypothesis, a new view over these materials. Well, these fragments, she reads them in the light of this idea that they are zodiac calendars, which use the position of the sun and the moon in the zodiac and in different cycles.
Her work is really complex. I mean, my hat is off to her. she can find the sort of connecting thread in all of these little fragments, and to come up with this, this whole interpretation of something that somebody else might take a look at and say, oh no, not going there, not touching that. So, she's really done such a massive amount of work, and her diagrams in this chapter, are really, really helpful.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, and she coins this expression, which is distinctive of the zodiac calendars.
Yeah.
That we're also using divination, but
right, precisely. Yeah.
And then we have also chapter about bibliomancy. Shraga Bar-On, who wrote his dissertation about Sefer Goralot. Goralot is the word in Hebrew for these lottery books, or lottery books for bibliomancy, but it's a term which is has several meanings, all of them referring to sorts. Then this chapter is very interesting because it starts just with an example in Israel, just in the 20th century, using bibliomancy to find the bodies of soldiers who were lost, and it was impossible to find them, to bury them properly. Then using bibliomancy, they are able to find them, and then moves back to the origins of bibliomancy, and explains that the use, of course, is always of the Bible, but it's not clear whether there was a change, and maybe, because this is not clear, maybe Jews started to use other books for bibliomancy also.
Yeah, I loved that modern example that he began his speech with. I mean, it just grabbed your attention.
Yeah, just in the middle of the thing of the subject.
Yeah, it's in radio space. It's like, you are here. It was just such a wonderful example, and I guess I wasn't really aware that this is still used.
And there is also a discussion about Maimonides. We have a chapter about Maimonides by Dr. Schwartz. Then he says that Maimonides has a double understanding of magic. There is a professional magic and a popular magic, and there is also idolatry, one which is true idolatry, and other that is not idolatry, only looks like idolatry. And what's the difference between this magic and idolatry, these two levels? The difference in both cases is the presence of the stellar sciences.
Yeah.
Well, and maybe, I don't know, Dorian, do you want to say something about Joseph Ziegler and physiognomy? Because there is also this long tradition in the classic world.
Yes, physiognomy is extremely important. Even certainly in the Greco-Roman period, and if anybody's interested in that particularly, they could take a look at Tamsin Barton's book on physiognomy, whose name I cannot recall at the moment, sitting on my shelf. But
I don't know if the noun the name is pronounced this well, but anyway, Popovich has a wonderful book about the physiognomy. But what is very distinctive about this chapter is that Ziegler is defending that physiognomy is not really a divinatory practice.
Right.
Well, sometimes it's related to divination, but it's mainly a little it's of course used in medicine also. He mentions that, but for him, it's in Judaism more a kind of spiritual technique, and in this way it was used in Qumran and also in Merkaba and Halot literature, which is the mystical literature of mystical Jewish literature, and also in the Suhar. To gain knowledge using physiognomy about the spiritual character of the person. I mean, is going to be a good disciple? Is going to be a good Kabbalist? Is going to get some insights of the nature of the person, but with a spiritual intention. Yeah, it's not.
Which is very important to be aware of. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we have said all of them. Have I forgotten someone?
I think so. Yes, I think so. I mean, each one in its turn is bringing up a really interesting viewpoint and a really interesting topic, and while you might think at first glance that they just have no relationship to one another, and Josefina has really done a wonderful job in the introduction of connecting the threads amongst all of the different essays in a really important way that I think allows you to draw together all the topics of the book into this nice little cluster. And the thing is that with a book like this, which has only 10 studies really, but it just opens the door to so many other investigations. Yes. So it really, it's not only complete in itself, but it opens up doors to people taking up further interesting topics, like, as you say, the Ashkenaz component of this whole thing.
With what already it's done, and of course it opens doors, but I think it gives a good guide.
Absolutely.
For someone who wants to enter in this topic, so it has a multiplicity of perspectives and topics that give you an idea of the universe which you are dealing with, and the importance of each subject, how it's integrated. So in that regard, I think the book
all kinds of scholars. I mean, we have very well established scholars, and we have people who are starting, they finish recently their PhDs, and they are studying, and they are wonderful scholars. Then, but we have scholars in all the stages somehow. It's great.
Yeah, it was really such a delight to work with all of them, because they all have their different perspectives, but everybody has something really important to contribute.
It was a very nice experience to work with the authors and to work with Dorian.
And to work with Josefina, and I'm so happy you asked me.
Yeah, well, it worked very. I think the end result was very good, well accomplished. So congratulations to the authors and the editors of the volume, because I think it's a wonderful contribution, and I believe it to be extremely valuable, not only to the history of astrology with the specific contributions on astrology, but also on other forms of divination and on the whole topic of divination in the Jewish context. So congratulations, and we will be looking forward for new works and new research on these topics and others that you will be working on. So it was a pleasure to have you here to discuss the book, and I hope to see you soon in other podcasts, so we could continue these and other discussions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luis. Thank you, Dorian.